The shadow on the wall didn't match any human form. Welcome to Holmes Mystery. I am your host, Lucien Moreau. Tell me where you're watching from today. I'm grateful for every one of you. Let's begin. We had scarcely descended the 17 steps of Baker Street when Holmes, who had said nothing since taking up his cane, turned sharply to our client. "You came by hansom, Mr. Carraway?" "Yes." "Dismissed it at the corner rather than before our door?" Carraway looked astonished. "I did, but how—" "You fear being followed, yet you are not accustomed to concealment. Your boots carry mud from the west pavement of Baker Street, not the curb before this house. Continue." The man passed a trembling hand across his brow. "Since Jonathan's death I have felt watched. I know how it sounds." "It sounds," said Holmes, "rigged like either a guilty conscience, a dangerous enemy, or a nervous system badly strained. We shall determine which." The fog thickened as we drove westward, swallowing the lamps until each became a blurred yellow eye. Carraway sat opposite us in the cab, hunched within his coat, while Holmes leaned back with closed eyes. To another observer he might have seemed asleep, but I knew well that his mind was already ranging over the few strange facts laid before him. A dead man, a lamp, and a shadow which had assumed a form not its own. "Your brother's household," Holmes said suddenly. "Who was present on the night of his death?" "His housekeeper, Mrs. Bale, a footman named Harker, and his secretary, Mr. Felix Marr. I had dined there earlier, but left before 10. "At what hour was the body found?" "A little after 11, Mrs." Bale heard a cry, not loud, she said, but sharp. She and Harker found the study door locked from within. They sent for me, as I lived nearby. When I arrived, we forced it." "And the window?" "Fastened." Holmes opened one eye. "A sealed room. Excellent. London improves as the evening advances." I could not share his enthusiasm. "Was there any letter, any sign that your brother expected danger?" Carraway hesitated. "There was one matter. Jonathan had lately become agitated over a business arrangement. He had quarrelled with a gentleman named Silas Venn." Holmes's eyelids lifted fully. "Ah. Venn is a dealer in optical instruments, lenses, lanterns, photographic plates, such things. Jonathan had invested in his workshop, but accused him of fraud." "A dealer in optical instruments," Holmes repeated softly. "And you bring me a mystery concerning a shadow. Pray continue." Carraway seemed to realize the force of his own words. "You suspect him?" "I suspect only that facts enjoy arriving in pairs. It is our task to learn whether they are married or merely acquainted." The Carraway residence stood in a quiet Kensington square, its black railings shining with moisture. A constable admitted us, and in the hall we found Inspector Lestrade, thin, sharp-faced, and wearing the expression of a man who resented mysteries chiefly because they interfered with paperwork. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I thought this business might draw you, though I warn you there is little here but grief and fancy." "Then I shall tread softly among both," Holmes answered. Lestrade gave me a nod. "The doctor says heart failure." "The brother insists on ghosts." "Between the two, or I prefer the doctor." Holmes smiled. "A commendable preference. Doctors are generally more punctual than ghosts." We were shown into the study. It was a handsome room, panelled in dark wood, with shelves of ledgers and legal volumes lining the walls. A large writing table stood near the centre, and behind it, upon the wall, hung a framed map of the Crimea. On the desk rested a green-shaded lamp, now unlit. The chair in which Jonathan Carraway had died remained pushed slightly back, as though he had stiffened at some sudden sight. Holmes did not approach the body's former position at once. Instead, he stood in the doorway, his head a little to one side, taking in the arrangement of the room as a painter might study a composition. "The lamp was burning here?" he asked. "Yes," said Lestrade, "on the desk." "And Mr.
Carroway sat there," Lestrade pointed, facing the door. Holmes crossed the carpet lightly. "Then his shadow would have fallen behind him, upon that wall." "That is what they claim." Holmes lowered himself to the dead man's chair and looked back over his shoulder. "Watson, observe the lamp, the chair, and the map. What strikes you?" I examined them carefully, reluctant to disappoint him. The shadow, if cast by the lamp, would fall partly upon the map. Just so. Yet Mr. Carroway described it upon the wall behind the chair, not upon the map. Why? Lestrade frowned. Perhaps he spoke loosely. Men terrified by trifles may speak loosely. Men terrified by exact impressions are often precise. Holmes rose and bent over the lamp. He removed the green shade, held it to the light, then sniffed the wick. "Recently cleaned," said he. "Here, not by the police, I trust?" "No," Lestrade replied. "Mrs. Bales says Mr. Jonathan always trimmed his own lamps." Holmes' long fingers moved along the brass stem. At its base he paused. "There is a scratch here, fresh. The lamp has been shifted and set back." "By us, perhaps," said Lestrade. Holmes looked at him. "Inspector, if you had moved it, you would have placed it straight. This lamp is 1 inch too far to the left for the dust mark on the desk." Lestrade bent and muttered something inaudible. Holmes next examined the carpet, the skirting board, and finally the map itself. At the lower edge of its frame, he discovered a minute clot of dark wax, scarcely larger than a pinhead. He touched it, smelled it, and slipped it into an envelope without comment. "What is that?" I asked. "An argument," said Holmes.
"Art which has not yet chosen its side." At that moment there came a sound from the hall, and a young man appeared in the doorway. He was pale, elegant, and nervous, with a narrow face and dark, watchful eyes. "This is Mr. Marr," said Carroway, "my brother's secretary." Felix Marr bowed, though his gaze rested not upon Holmes, but upon the desk. "I beg your pardon," said he. "I did not know strangers were here." "Nor did your feet," Holmes replied mildly. "You came in haste, yet stopped outside to listen." Marr flushed. "I was anxious." "Anxiety is a very crowded word," said Holmes. "Tell me, Mr. Marr, did your employer receive visitors on the night of his death?" "No, sir." Holmes watched him. "None?" The young secretary moistened his lips. "None that I admitted." It was a small correction, but Holmes's eyes gleamed.
"Then we must discover," said he, "who entered without your assistance." The faint emphasis Holmes placed upon those last words did not escape me, nor, I think, did it escape Mr. Felix Marr. The young man shifted his weight uneasily, his fingers tightening upon the back of a nearby chair. "I assure you," said he, "no one could have entered. The door was locked, and I myself had secured the windows earlier that evening." Holmes regarded him with that half-lidded gaze which I have so often seen precede a most penetrating inquiry. "Earlier that evening? At what hour precisely?" "Shortly after 9. "And you remained in the house thereafter?" "Yes, until Mr. Carroway's death was discovered." Holmes nodded slowly as though committing each word to some internal ledger. "You are a most conscientious secretary, Mr. Marr. Tell me, did your employer often work so late?" "He did, particularly of late. There were financial concerns, connected perhaps with Mr. Silas Venn?" Marr's eyes flickered, though he answered at once. "Yes." Mr. Venn's dealings had become a source of great strain. "Indeed." Holmes turned away from him
as if the matter were of no further consequence, and resumed his quiet survey of the room. Yet I could see, by the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, that Ma's reaction had not gone unnoticed. Inspector Lestrade cleared his throat. "We have already spoken to this Mr. Venn," said he. "He denies any wrongdoing, of course, but his accounts are in some disorder. Still, there is nothing to connect him directly with the death." "Nothing visible, perhaps," Holmes murmured. Carraway, who had remained near the door, had now stepped forward. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, this talk of business and accounts, what of the shadow? That is what I saw. That is what I cannot explain." Holmes turned to him with sudden intensity. "And you shall have your explanation, Mr. Carraway, but not, I think, in the form you expect. Let us first be certain that what you observed was not an illusion of light or of the nerves." "I tell you, it was no illusion." "I do not doubt that you saw it," said Holmes calmly. "I merely question what it was that you saw." There was something in his tone which, though gentle, carried a quiet authority. Carraway subsided, though his agitation remained evident. Holmes moved once more to the desk and relit the lamp. The soft glow spread across the room, casting long shadows upon the panelled walls, and he adjusted the position of the lamp by a fraction of an inch, then seated himself in the dead man's chair. "Watson," said he, "stand where Mr. Carraway stood when he first entered." I took up the indicated position near the door. "Now observe," Holmes continued, leaning slightly forward so that the light fell upon his shoulder. A shadow sprang up behind him, tall and well-defined against the wall. "Quite ordinary," I said. "Precisely. Now—" He shifted the lamp again, this time angling it slightly. The shadow altered, lengthening and distorting, though still unmistakably his own. Lestrade folded his arms. "You see, Mr. Carraway, light plays tricks." "Not tricks of identity, Inspector," Holmes replied. "Distortion, yes, but transformation, no." He rose abruptly and crossed to the wall, where he examined the panelling with minute attention. His fingers traced along the seams between the boards, pausing here and there, as though feeling for some irregularity. At last he stepped back. "Inspector, has this wall been tampered with?" Lestrade looked surprised. "Tampered with? No, it's solid oak." Holmes tapped lightly upon it with his knuckles. The sound was firm, yet not entirely uniform. In one section, scarcely wider than a man's shoulders, the note was subtly different. "Ah," said Holmes softly. He turned to Carraway. "Your brother had no reason to conceal anything within this room?" "None that I know of." "And yet," Holmes continued, "this panel has been opened, recently, and with care." Lestrade stepped forward at once. "Opened? That's impossible. We examined—" "With your eyes, Inspector," said Holmes, "not with your ears." Before further protest could be made, Holmes had drawn a thin blade from his pocket and inserted it delicately into the seam. With a slight pressure, the panel shifted inward by a fraction, then swung open with a faint creak. Behind it lay a narrow recess, no more than a foot in depth, yet sufficient to conceal a slender object or a slender man. A murmur escaped from Carraway. "Good heavens!" Holmes peered within, his expression keen. "Empty now, but not long so. There are scuff marks upon the inner wood. Recent. And yes, traces of grease." "Grease?" I echoed. "From machinery, perhaps, or from some implement handled frequently." Lestrade leaned in, his scepticism giving way to interest. "Then someone was hiding here." "Or something," Holmes replied. "Let us not limit ourselves prematurely." He straightened and glanced once more at the lamp, and then at the wall where the shadow had been seen. A concealed space, a movable light source, and a witness who reports a shadow inconsistent with the body before it. He clasped his hands behind his back. The elements begin to arrange themselves. Carraway stepped closer, his voice trembling. "You mean there was someone else in the room?" Holmes turned to him. "I mean, Mr. Carraway, that your brother did not die alone." A chill passed through me at his words, for the quiet certainty with which they were spoken admitted no doubt. "But if that is so," said Lestrade, "how did the fellow escape?" "The door was locked, the windows fastened." Holmes smiled faintly. "You observe the difficulty, Inspector. I propose to remove it." At that moment, from somewhere in the house, there came the faint sound of a door closing, soft, deliberate,
And unmistakably cautious. Holmes's head snapped up. "Ah," said he quietly, "we may not need to look far for our next answer." Holmes was already in motion, before any of us had fully registered the sound. With a swift, silent stride, he crossed the room and reached the door, pausing only to extinguish the lamp with a deft turn of his fingers. "Not a word," he whispered. The study fell at once into darkness, broken only by the faint glow filtering in from the hall. I followed closely behind him, my pulse quickened, while Lestrade, less accustomed to such sudden manoeuvres, hesitated but a moment before joining us. Carraway remained rooted where he stood, his breath audible in the stillness. The corridor beyond lay dim and quiet, yet the echo of that closing door lingered in my ears. Holmes moved with cat-like precision,
in his head slightly inclined, as though listening not merely for sound but for intention itself. "There," he murmured. At the far end of the passage, a figure had just turned the corner, no more than a fleeting silhouette, yet sufficient to confirm that we were not alone. "After him!" cried Lestrade, abandoning stealth in favour of pursuit. We hurried down the corridor and into a narrower passage which led toward the rear of the house. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of damp stone suggested we were approaching a service entrance or perhaps the garden beyond. Holmes slowed as we neared a small door, now standing ajar. "He's gone out," said Lestrade, pushing it open. "Quick, before he gains the street." But Holmes laid a hand upon his arm. "One moment, Inspector." Lestrade turned impatiently. "We'll lose him." "If we rush blindly, I think we shall lose more than that," Holmes replied calmly. "Observe." He pointed to the ground just beyond the threshold. The soft earth bore the impression of recent footsteps, light, narrow, and unevenly spaced. "A man in haste," I said. "Not merely haste," Holmes corrected. "Injury. The left foot drags slightly." Lestrade bent closer. "You're right. There's a scuff here. See it?" Holmes nodded. "Our intruder is either lame or has recently sustained a wound. That may prove most useful." Without further delay, we stepped out into the garden. The fog had penetrated even this enclosed space, curling low among the shrubs and casting shifting shadows beneath the weak glow of a distant lamp. For a moment all was still, then from beyond the rear gate came the sound of hurried movement, a stumble followed by the scrape of metal, and Holmes darted forward, reached the gate, and flung it open. We emerged into a narrow alley just in time to glimpse our quarry, a slight figure in a dark coat, turning into the street beyond. "Stop!" shouted Lestrade. The figure did not pause. What followed was a chase through the fog-bound streets of Kensington such as I had seldom experienced. Our pursuit was hampered by the poor visibility, yet the sound of uneven footsteps ahead provided a guide. Twice we nearly lost him at intersections, only to regain the trail by the distinctive drag of his stride. At last, as we turned into a broader thoroughfare, the fugitive faltered. His injured foot betrayed him, and he stumbled against a lamp-post, clutching it for support. Holmes closed the distance in an instant. "My dear sir," said he, seizing the man firmly by the arm, "your evening promenade appears to have exceeded your capacity." The man struggled weakly, but Lestrade was upon him at once. "Got you now," the inspector growled. "Let's have a look at you." Under the lamplight, the fugitive's face was revealed, and I recognized him at once. "Mr. Marr," I exclaimed. The young secretary's composure had entirely deserted him. His pale features were drawn with fear, and his eyes darted between us like those of a trapped animal. I can explain," he stammered. "I have no doubt of it," said Holmes. "Indeed, I shall insist upon it. But first, your foot." Marr winced as Holmes bent to examine the left shoe. The leather was scuffed and torn near the toe, and a dark stain, whether mud or something more ominous, clung to its edge. "You have been in some difficulty," Holmes observed.
When did you receive this injury? It is nothing. A fall earlier today. Earlier tonight, Holmes corrected quietly. And within the grounds of your employer's house. Marr's lips trembled, but he said nothing. Lestrade tightened his grip.
"You'd best come quietly, Mr. Marr. Running about in the fog after a gentleman's death doesn't look well on you." "I meant no harm," Marr burst out. "I only wished to retrieve something," Holmes finished. "Something you feared we might discover in that concealed recess." The young man's silence was answer enough. Holmes straightened, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "You see, Watson, how obliging circumstances can be. We seek a hidden presence, and it presents itself, albeit somewhat breathless, upon the public street." "But what does it mean?" I asked. Was he the one concealed in the study? Did he kill Mr. Carroway?" Holmes glanced at Marr, then back at me. "That, my dear Watson, is the question which now demands our full attention. For while Mr. Marr has undoubtedly played a role in this curious affair, I am far from convinced that he has told us the whole story, or that he alone could have produced so singular an effect as a shadow which refuses to resemble its source." Marr shuddered. "You do not understand. None of you do." Holmes' eyes gleamed faintly. "On the contrary, Mr. Marr, I understand that you are frightened. The more interesting inquiry is, of whom?" At this, the young man gave a broken laugh, devoid of mirth. "You think I fear the law?" he said hoarsely. "No, Mr. Holmes, it is not the law that I fear." A faint breeze stirred the fog, and for an instant the lamplight flickered, casting our shadows long upon the pavement. Holmes watched them closely. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself. "So I begin to suspect." Holmes did not immediately press the man further, but instead regarded the shifting shadows upon the pavement with a curious absorption. The lamplight trembled in the damp air, stretching and contracting our outlines in grotesque elongation. "You observe, Watson," said he softly, "how easily a shadow may be altered in length, yet never in essential form. However distorted, it remains faithful to its source. That fidelity, when broken, must be accounted for by intervention, not illusion." Lestrade, who had little patience for abstraction, gave Marr a firm shake. "You'll have time enough for philosophy at the Yard. For now you'll answer plain questions. What were you doing creeping about your employer's house after his death?" Marr swallowed, his composure hanging by a thread. "I told you I came to retrieve something." "What?" Lestrade demanded. The young man hesitated, then glanced toward Holmes with a strange mixture of dread and reluctant admiration. "A device," he said at last. Holmes' expression sharpened. "Describe it." Was a small apparatus made of brass and glass. It fits within the hand. Lenses, mirrors. I scarcely understand it myself. Yet you deemed it important enough to risk returning for it, Holmes remarked. Yes, because it does not belong to me. Nor did it belong to Mr. Carroway. Mar's voice dropped. It belongs to Mr. Silas Venn. At the mention of that name, Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, said he, the dealer in optical instruments returns to the foreground.
As I had hoped he might. Pray continue. Mar shifted uneasily under Lestrade's grip. Mr. Venn had been supplying certain experimental devices to my employer. At first, they were harmless. Curiosities, demonstrations of light and reflection. But recently they became something else. In what manner? I asked. They could alter perception, Mar said, his voice trembling. Not merely distort, but replace. A shadow might be cast which did not correspond to the object before it. A reflection might show what is not present. Mr. Carroway believed it a novelty at first, but when he realized its implications, he shook his head. He grew afraid. Holmes leaned slightly forward. Implications of what nature? Deception, Mar replied. Perfect deception. A man might appear alone while another stood beside him, concealed not by darkness.
Aye, but by the manipulation of light itself. Or worse, he might seem to be someone he is not. Lestrade snorted. You expect us to believe in conjurers' tricks as murder weapons? Holmes raised a hand. On the contrary, Inspector, I find the notion most stimulating. Continue, Mr. Marr. My employer confronted Mr. Venn, Marr went on. He accused him of intending to sell these devices for criminal purposes, espionage, fraud, perhaps even assassination. There was a terrible argument. Mr. Venn left in anger, and I believed the matter ended. But it did not, Holmes said quietly. No. 2 nights later, Mr. Venn returned. I did not admit him, I swear it, but he must have entered by some other means. I heard voices in the study, raised, urgent, then a cry. And you did nothing? Lestrade interjected sharply.
I feared for my position, my safety, everything, Marr cried. I remained in the corridor. When all fell silent, I dared not enter. It was Mrs. Bale who raised the alarm. Holmes considered this. And the device? It was in the study. I saw it upon the desk when we forced the door. I knew at once what it was and what it might imply. If it were found, if its purpose were understood, it would ruin me as well, for I had assisted in its demonstration. So you concealed it, I said. Yes. While the others were distracted, I slipped it into the recess behind the panel. I meant to retrieve it later, once the house was quiet. Holmes nodded slowly. A prudent, if morally questionable, decision. Lestrade frowned. But that still doesn't explain the death.
Or are you saying this Venn fellow used his gadget to frighten Carroway to death with a false shadow? Marr shook his head. I do not know, but I saw the shadow myself after the others had entered. It was wrong, just as Mr. Carroway described. And for a moment, only a moment, I thought I saw another figure, overlapping his. A silence followed, broken only by the distant rumble of a passing carriage. Holmes spoke at last. Then we are confronted with the most curious possibility. A man enters a locked room by concealed means. He employs an optical device capable of altering shadows. A confrontation occurs, ending in death. Apparently natural, yet under circumstances designed to mislead. And the principal instrument of deception vanishes, hidden by a third party. He turned his gaze upon Marr. Tell me, Mr. Marr, this device.
Could it be operated by one man alone? I believe so. And could it be concealed upon the person? Yes. Holmes smiled faintly. Then we must suppose that Mr. Venn left the room with it, unless, of course, he had reason to abandon it. Ma hesitated. There is one thing more. Pray do not keep it, Holmes said. When I returned tonight, Ma continued, I found the panel already disturbed. The device was gone. Lestrade stiffened. Gone? You're certain? Yes. I had not yet reached it when I heard you in the study. I fled because I realized someone else had been there before me. Holmes's expression grew intent, and that someone, we may reasonably infer, is neither Mr. Marr nor Inspector Lestrade. Then who? I asked. Holmes glanced once more at the wavering shadows cast by the street lamp. A man, said he softly.
Why, who understands not only how to alter appearances, but how to remove himself from them entirely. Lestrade tightened his grip on Marr. We'll take him in and sort the rest at the yard. Holmes did not object, but as we turned back toward the house, I saw that his mind was already far ahead of us, tracing lines invisible to all but himself. And though we had gained a suspect and a motive of sorts, I could not shake the uneasy conviction that the true architect of this strange and troubling affair had yet to reveal himself. Holmes remained unusually silent during our return to Baker Street, a fact which, in my experience, signified not uncertainty, but rather an intense and focused reconstruction of events within his singular mind. Inspector Lestrade had taken charge of Felix Marr, escorting him toward Scotland Yard with the intention of extracting a fuller statement, while Holmes had declined to accompany them, preferring instead to allow the facts to breathe, as he so curiously phrased it. The fog had not lifted, and the journey back seemed longer than before, as though the city itself conspired to obscure clarity. When at last we reached our rooms, Holmes cast aside his coat and went directly to the mantel, where he stood for some minutes in thoughtful repose. You are forming a theory, I said. I am dismantling several, he replied. A more delicate operation. I seated myself, notebook in hand. Then let us examine what we have. Marr admits to concealing the device. He implicates this Mr. Venn as its creator and suggests he was present on the night of the death. The locked room may be explained by the concealed panel, and yet, Holmes continued, we are left with a death attributed to natural causes in a man not previously known to suffer from heart weakness, coinciding precisely with a confrontation involving a device capable of visual deception. It is too symmetrical to be coincidence. You believe the death was induced? Holmes turned, his eyes alight. I believe, Watson, that it was engineered. This declaration struck me with some force. By fear alone? Fear, said Holmes, is among the most potent of physiological agents. Under the proper stimulus, it may stop the heart as surely as any toxin. But the stimulus must be exact, personal, immediate, and utterly convincing. You suggest that Mr. Carraway saw something tailored to him? Precisely. And not merely a distorted shadow, but one that conveyed a meaning, perhaps even a recognition. I considered this. But how could such precision be achieved? Holmes smiled faintly. Through knowledge, Watson. Knowledge of the victim's mind, habits, and expectations. Which brings us to Mr. Silas Venn. At the mention of that name, Holmes crossed to his desk and began to sort through a small pile of papers, extracting a card which he handed to me. A tradesman of modest standing, I read aloud, specializing in optical instruments, experimental lenses, and projection devices. Not so modest as he appears, Holmes said. I made some preliminary inquiries while you were engaged with Mr. Marr. Venn has recently attracted the attention of certain private buyers, men not inclined toward scientific curiosity,
but rather toward practical advantage. You mean criminals? I mean men who find value in being unseen while observing others, Holmes replied. A chill passed through me. Then this device, is no mere novelty, Holmes finished. It is a prototype. And like all prototypes, it is imperfect. Its limitations are as important as its capabilities. He resumed his pacing. Consider. The shadow observed by Mr. Carraway was inconsistent with his own form. This suggests that the device was active at the time of death, yet the effect was not sustained. It vanished upon second observation. Why? Because the device was removed, I suggested. Or because its operation was momentary, Holmes countered. Perhaps requiring precise alignment or dependent upon a transient condition, light, angle, or proximity. I leaned forward.
And then the killer, if we may call him that, must have been in the room, manipulating the device at the moment of death. Indeed. And yet he leaves no trace of struggle, no wound, no poison. Only a frightened man and a misleading shadow. Holmes paused, then added quietly, and a missing instrument, which Ma failed to recover, or was prevented from recovering, Holmes said. His return tonight suggests urgency, perhaps even desperation. He feared not merely discovery, but the consequences of that device falling into other hands. Then someone else has it now, I said. Holmes inclined his head. Yes, and that someone had both the opportunity and the knowledge to retrieve it before Ma could do so. We fell into silence for a moment, each contemplating the narrowing circle of possibilities. At the house, I said slowly, Ma'am, there were only a few individuals with access. Mrs. Bale, the housekeeper, Harker, the footman, Ma himself, and, if he entered unseen, Mr. Venn. Holmes stopped pacing. Let us examine them in turn. Mrs. Bale, long in service, no known connection to Venn, unlikely to possess the technical knowledge required. Harker, less certain. A servant may observe more than he reveals. Ma, we have accounted for his actions, though not entirely his motives. And Venn, our most compelling figure, yet curiously absent. You think he returned? I think, said Holmes, that a man who risks exposure to conduct such an experiment would not abandon its results lightly. If the device remained in that room, he would seek to reclaim it. And he may have done so tonight, I said. Holmes nodded. Which brings us to the sound we heard, the cautious movement, or did the opened panel, the vanished instrument? I rose. Then we must find Venn at once. Holmes raised a hand. Not at once, Watson. A direct approach would alert him. He is already cautious, perhaps even alarmed. We must proceed with subtlety. He moved to the window and gazed out into the fog. There is another matter, he said, one which troubles me more than the rest. What is that? Holmes turned, his expression grave. The shadow. But we have accounted for it, have we not? The device accounts for its appearance, Holmes interrupted, but not for its purpose. Why create such a specific distortion? Why not conceal entirely rather than reveal incorrectly? I frowned. You mean the shadow was meant to be seen? Exactly. It was not a flaw, it was a message. The implication struck me at once. Then it was directed at Mr.
Carraway. Or at someone else who might later observe it, Holmes said. A signal, perhaps, or a warning. He resumed his seat, his fingers steepled. We are dealing, Watson, not merely with a clever device, but with a mind that understands both optics and psychology, a man who can manipulate not only what is seen, but what is believed. And such a man, I said quietly, would be exceedingly dangerous. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely, said he, which is why we must ensure that we are the ones who see him clearly. before he has the opportunity to disappear altogether. Holmes slept little that night, and I less. Though he had extinguished the lamps and retired to his couch, I could hear, at intervals, the faint rustle of movement or the soft strike of a match as he relit his pipe. When morning at last broke through the thinning fog,
It found him already dressed, seated at the breakfast table with a spread of newspapers and notes before him. "You have formed your plan," I observed as I took my seat. "I have formed several," said he. "One of them may even be correct." He pushed aside the papers and reached for his coffee. "Our first objective, Watson, is Mr. Silas Venn, a man of invention, secrecy, and recent agitation. Such individuals rarely vanish without leaving a trace." "And where shall we begin?" Holmes tapped the card he had shown me the previous evening. "His place of business in Clerkenwell. A modest workshop, outwardly devoted to lenses and optical curiosities. Inwardly, who can say?" Within the hour we were en route, the city now emerging from its nocturnal obscurity into the grey bustle of morning. Holmes remained alert throughout the journey, his gaze sweeping the streets with habitual vigilance. "You anticipate resistance?" I asked. "I anticipate absence," he replied, "which in some cases is more informative." The workshop of Silas Venn proved to be situated in a narrow lane, flanked by other small trades, clockmakers, engravers, and instrument sellers. Its exterior was unremarkable, save for a faded sign bearing the name Venn and Company Optical Devices. The door was locked. Holmes examined it briefly, then the windows, which were shuttered from within. "Closed," said he, "and recently." "How can you tell?" I asked. "The dust upon the sill is disturbed yet not settled. Someone departed in haste, but not long ago." He stepped back and surveyed the building. "Let us see whether Mr.
A. Venn has left us any farewell." With Lestrade's assistance, summoned by a brief note dispatched earlier, we gained entry. The interior was dim and cluttered, filled with shelves of lenses, mirrors, and brass instruments of varying complexity. The air bore the faint scent of oil and heated metal. Holmes moved through the room with swift precision, his eyes taking in every detail. "Observe, Watson, the arrangement of these tools, not chaotic, but interrupted, work in progress, abandoned abruptly." Lestrade frowned. "You mean he's run off?" "I mean," said Holmes, "that he has departed, which is not quite the same thing." He paused at a workbench near the rear, where a partially assembled device lay amid scattered components. It resembled in miniature the description given by Marr: brass fittings, angled mirrors, and a small adjustable lens.
Holmes bent over it, his expression intent. "A prototype, incomplete, but instructive." "Can you make sense of it?" I asked. "To a degree," he replied. "It appears to project an image by manipulating reflected light, yet not in the conventional manner. The mirrors are arranged to produce a secondary outline offset from the primary source." "A false shadow," I said. "Precisely. But more than that, it can be shaped, altered, even designed." Lestrade crossed his arms. "All very clever, but it doesn't tell us where the man's gone." Holmes straightened. "On the contrary, Inspector, it tells us a great deal. A man who abandons such work does so under compulsion, either fear or necessity. And in either case, he takes with him what he considers essential." "The device," I said. "Or its successor," Holmes replied. "This is but an earlier model. The one used at Carraway's house was more refined, capable of producing a distinct and convincing alteration." He moved to a small cabinet and opened it. Inside were several drawers, some empty, others containing neatly arranged components. One drawer, however, stood ajar. Holmes examined it closely. "Removed in haste. The indentation suggests a compact object, rectangular with curved edges. The device Ma described, I suggested. Very likely. Lestrade sighed. So we're back where we started. No man, no weapon, and a dead gentleman with a weak heart. Holmes smiled faintly. Not quite, Inspector. We now know that Mr. Venn has fled, or at least vacated his premises, with the instrument in question. That narrows our field considerably. He turned to me. Watson, you recall, Mr. Ma's statement that the shadow appeared only momentarily? Yes. And that it differed not merely in shape, but in character. Broader shoulders, altered head? Indeed. Holmes nodded. Such specificity suggests intention. The shadow was not random, it was chosen, which implies that the operator wished the victim to perceive a particular figure. A known figure? I asked. Almost certainly, Holmes replied. Someone whose appearance would provoke a strong reaction, fear, perhaps even recognition. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You think the shadow resembled someone Carraway knew? I think, said Holmes, that it resembled someone he feared. A silence followed this remark. Then we must learn who that might be, I said. Just so, Holmes agreed. And for that, we returned to Kensington. By early afternoon, we were once more within the Carraway residence. The atmosphere had shifted subtly since our previous visit. Less confusion, perhaps, but more unease, as though the house itself sensed that its secrets were being drawn into the light. Mrs. Bale received us in the drawing-room, her manner composed but strained. "You have news?" she asked. "Questions," Holmes replied. "About your late employer?" She inclined her head. "I shall answer what I can." Holmes seated himself opposite her. "Mrs. Bale, did Mr. Carraway ever speak of a man he feared? Not in business, but personally? Someone from his past, perhaps?" The housekeeper hesitated. There was one name he mentioned on occasion, not often, but with great discomfort. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Pray tell me." "Mr. Adrian Holt," she said, "an associate from many years ago. They had some disagreement. Mr. Carraway would not speak of it in detail, but I gathered it was serious." "Is this Mr. Holt still living?" Holmes asked. "I believe so, though I haven't heard the name in recent years." Holmes rose at once, his eyes alight with renewed purpose. "Then we must," said he, "bring the past into the present, for I suspect that the shadow which frightened Mr. Carraway to death was not merely a trick of light, but a reflection of something he had long sought to forget." Holmes wasted no time in pursuing this new thread, and within the hour we had secured from Mrs. Bale what little further information she possessed regarding the man named Adrian Holt. It was scant enough, an old associate, perhaps once a partner, and whose name had not been uttered in the house for years, save in moments of agitation. Yet the manner in which she spoke it, with a certain unease and hesitation, lent it a significance far beyond its brevity. "Memory," said Holmes as we departed once more into the afternoon streets, "is rarely stirred without cause. If Mr. Carraway recalled this Holt at intervals of distress, then the man represents not merely a figure from the past, but a source of unresolved tension, possibly guilt, possibly fear." "And you believe Venn knew of this?" I asked. Holmes adjusted his gloves. "I believe Venn knew something. Whether he understood its full weight is another matter, but a device such as his, capable of shaping shadows, would be of little value unless guided by psychological insight. So one must know what image to project in order to produce the desired effect." We made our way to a nearby telegraph office, where Holmes dispatched several inquiries with his usual economy of language. Within a short time, replies began to arrive, and from these he pieced together the outline of a man long absent from London society. "Adrian Holt," he said, folding one of the telegrams. formerly engaged in speculative ventures with Mr. Carraway some 15 years ago. Their partnership ended abruptly amid allegations of financial misconduct. Holt disappeared soon thereafter, some say abroad, others that he remained in England under a different name. A disgraced man, then, I said. Or a wronged one, Holmes replied. The distinction is often a matter of perspective and documentation. Lestrade, who had joined us again upon receiving Holmes's summons, looked unconvinced. Even if this Holt exists, what has he to do with our case? You don't suggest he's returned to haunt Carraway through shadows and trickery? Holmes gave a faint smile. I suggest nothing so theatrical, Inspector. But I do suggest that if Mr. Venn wished to frighten Carraway to the point of collapse, he might choose to evoke a figure from his past, one associated with betrayal or ruin. And you think he found this Holt and used his likeness? Or at least a description sufficient to construct it, Holmes said. The device need not reproduce a perfect image, only one convincing enough in outline to trigger recognition. Lestrade shook his head. It's a stretch. It is a chain, Holmes corrected, and each link, though slender, connects to the next. By late afternoon we had traced Holt's last known address, a modest lodging in Bloomsbury, now occupied by another tenant. The landlady, a talkative woman of indeterminate age, proved more forthcoming than precise. Yes, Mr. Holt lived here once, she said. Quiet gentleman, kept to himself, paid regularly, though not generously. Left some years ago, 5, perhaps 6. Did he receive visitors? Holmes asked. Rarely, though there was one, a man with a sharp face and spectacles, came by several times near the end. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Can you describe him further? Tallish, thin, always in a dark coat, spoke very precisely like a schoolmaster. I remember thinking he looked at things too closely, like he was measuring them. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. And did you hear his name? No, sir. Oh, but I recall Mr. Holt seemed uneasy after those visits. Not frightened exactly, but troubled. Did Holt leave any forwarding address? No, just packed his things and went. Left no word. Holmes thanked her and stepped back into the street, his expression thoughtful. That description, I said. Could it be Venn? It aligns rather neatly, Holmes replied. A man of optical precision with a habit of close observation. It would not surprise me if Venn sought out Holt for information, perhaps under the guise of business, perhaps with more ulterior motives. But if Holt has been gone for years, Lestrade interjected, how could his likeness be used now? Holmes turned to him. Memory, Inspector, is a powerful template. A sufficiently detailed account, height, build, posture, combined with the suggestive power of shadow, might be enough to evoke recognition in a mind already predisposed to recall. Then the shadow Carraway saw, I began, was not merely unfamiliar, Holmes finished, but remembered. The implication settled heavily upon me. And if that is so, I said slowly, then the effect would be all the more shocking. Not a stranger, but a ghost from his own past. Precisely, Holmes said. Lestrade folded his arms. All very clever, but we still haven't found Venn, or this device of his. Holmes nodded, which suggests that we must alter our approach. Rather than pursue him directly, we must consider where he might go and why. He began to walk, his pace measured. A man in possession of a unique instrument, recently involved in a death, and aware that his premises have been entered by the police. Such a man will not linger. He will seek either to conceal himself or to complete whatever objective he has set in motion. You think he has another target? I asked. Holmes stopped. I think, said he quietly, that the death of Mr. Carraway may not have been an isolated experiment, but a demonstration Lestrade looked sharply at him. Demonstration? For whom? Holmes's gaze lifted slightly, as though tracing an invisible line. For someone, he said, who wished to see just how far a shadow might be made to resemble a man, and how far a man might be driven by what he believes he sees. A cold certainty settled over us. Then we must act quickly, I said. Holmes inclined his head. Yes, for if I am correct, the next appearance of that altered shadow will not be an accident, but a signal, and when it appears, it will do so with purpose. He turned, his eyes keen and resolute, and we must be there to witness it, not as victims, but as observers. Holmes's words remained with me as we retraced our steps through the waning light of the afternoon. There was a new urgency in his manner now, not the excitement of mere intellectual pursuit, but the controlled intensity of a man who senses that events are moving toward a decisive moment. We must determine, said he, for whom such a demonstration would hold value. Not every criminal requires illusion, only those whose objectives depend upon perception rather than force. Lestrade gave a short grunt. You mean blackmail, fraud, or intimidation? Just so, Holmes replied. Or the manipulation of testimony. Imagine a witness who swears to have seen a man present when he was not, or absent when he was.
Courts have hanged men on less certain evidence. I felt a chill at the thought. Then Venn's device could be used to construct false alibis or false accusations. An elegant weapon, Holmes murmured. Invisible in operation, devastating in consequence. We had by now returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately set about arranging a series of inquiries. Messages were dispatched to various contacts, some official, others of a more discreet nature. Among them, I noted, were requests concerning recent financial movements connected to Mr. Carraway's estate and any parties who might stand to benefit from his sudden demise. You suspect a broader scheme? I asked as he sealed the final envelope. I suspect, said Holmes, that Carraway's death served a purpose beyond itself. Whether that purpose was to eliminate him, to test the device, or to influence another party remains to be seen, but such precision rarely exists in isolation. The evening drew in, and with it came replies, fragmentary at first, then increasingly suggestive. One in particular seemed to capture Holmes's full attention. Ah, said he, holding the telegram up to the light. Now we begin to glimpse the outline behind the shadow. What is it? I asked. A legal matter, Holmes replied. Mr. Carraway was engaged in a pending arbitration, one involving a substantial sum and several competing interests. Among those named is a certain Mr. Edwin Larchmont, another business associate, an adversary more precisely. Larchmont stands to gain considerably should Carraway's position collapse, and, most interestingly, he has recently retained the services of a private consultant. Lestrade, who had just entered,
removed his gloves. Let me guess you're Mr. Venn? Holmes inclined his head. The very same. Well then, said Lestrade, we've got motive enough. Larchmont hires Venn, Venn frightens Carraway to death with his contraption, and the estate falls into dispute. Case closed. Holmes smiled faintly. A tempting conclusion, Inspector, but premature. For one thing, it does not account for the peculiar nature of the shadow itself. If the objective were merely to kill, simpler methods abound. Why employ so elaborate a device? To make it look natural, Lestrade suggested. Perhaps, Holmes said. But then why leave behind so striking an anomaly, a shadow that invites scrutiny rather than deflects it? I considered this. Unless the anomaly was intended to be noticed by someone specific. Holmes turned to me with approval. Excellent, Watson. One that is precisely the direction in which my thoughts are moving. Lestrade frowned. You mean Carraway wasn't the only target? Or not the final one, Holmes replied. Suppose the shadow was not merely a means of inducing death, but a signal, a demonstration directed at a third party, someone who would recognize its significance. And who might that be? I asked. Holmes reached for another telegram. Mr. Edwin Larchmont is expected to attend a private gathering this evening at his residence in Hampstead. A small affair by all accounts, with several individuals connected to the arbitration. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. You think something will happen there? I think, said Holmes, or that if Venn is indeed in Larchmont's employ, or acting in concert with him, then tonight may offer an opportunity to observe the device in operation once more. And if we're wrong? Lestrade asked. Holmes shrugged lightly. Then we shall have enjoyed an evening in agreeable company. There was a glint in his eye which belied the casual tone. Arrangements were quickly made. By means of a discreet introduction, facilitated through one of Holmes's many connections, we secured invitations to the gathering. Our roles were to be those of interested observers, nothing more. As we made our way to Hampstead later that evening, the fog had returned, though less densely than before. The lamps shone clearer now, casting steady pools of light upon the pavement. "You're expecting the shadow to appear again," I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Ordered if my reasoning is sound, then yes, and if it does, we must be prepared not merely to see it, but to understand it." "And then?" "He will be there," Holmes replied. "Of that I am nearly certain. Whether openly or concealed, he cannot resist the completion of his design." Lestrade adjusted his collar. "And if we catch him in the act?" "Then," said Holmes, "we shall have both the man and the method, but we must proceed with care. A premature move may drive him to desperation, or worse, into invisibility once more." We arrived at Larchmont's residence, a large and well-appointed house, set back from the road, its windows aglow with warm light. A footman admitted us, and we were shown into a drawing-room, where a small number of guests had already gathered. Mr. Edwin Larchmont himself stood near the fireplace, a tall, composed man with a measured manner and a keen, appraising gaze. He greeted us with polite formality, though I could not help but feel that his eyes lingered upon Holmes a fraction longer than courtesy required. As the evening progressed, conversation flowed easily, yet beneath it I sensed a current of tension, subtle but unmistakable. Holmes moved among the guests with quiet attentiveness, his observations as precise as ever. At one point he drew me aside. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the arrangement of the lamps in this room." I glanced about. Several stood upon tables and mantels, their light carefully directed. "They seem deliberate," I said. "Exceedingly so," Holmes replied. "And note the position of that screen near the far wall. It casts a narrow field of shadow, perfectly aligned with the central seating area." A faint unease stirred within me. "You think?" "I think," said Holmes softly, "that we are not the only ones who have come here to observe." At that very moment, one of the lamps flickered just once, and the shadows upon the wall shifted ever so slightly. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Ah," he whispered, "the performance begins." I followed Holmes's gaze at once, my attention fixed upon the far wall where the shifting lamplight cast its restless silhouettes. At first, there was nothing remarkable, only the ordinary interplay of light and movement as the guests conversed and passed before the lamps. Yet Holmes remained utterly still beside me, his eyes narrowed to a degree which I had come to recognize as a signal of the utmost concentration. Do not look too directly, he murmured. Let it come to you. I forced myself to resume a more natural posture, though every nerve within me strained toward that wall. The murmur of conversation continued about us, punctuated by the occasional clink of glass or subdued laughter. Mr. Larchmont himself had taken a position near the centre of the room, engaged in discussion with two gentlemen whose faces I did not know. Then quite suddenly it happened. A figure moved across the lamplight. Larchmont himself, as he shifted his stance, his shadow sprang up behind him, tall and well-defined. For an instant it was entirely natural. Then it changed. The alteration was subtle, so subtle that I might have dismissed it had I not been forewarned. The shoulders broadened slightly, the line of the head sharpened, and the posture assumed a rigidity which did not correspond to the man before us. It was as though another presence had overlaid itself upon the original form, an intrusion rather than a distortion. I felt a tightening in my chest. "Holmes," I whispered. "I see it," he replied, scarcely audible. The shadow lingered in that altered state for no more than a second, perhaps less, before returning to its proper outline. Larchmont himself appeared unaware, continuing his conversation without interruption. Yet I noticed something else. One of the gentlemen beside him, a thin, pale individual with a nervous expression, had gone quite still. His eyes were fixed upon the wall, and his lips had parted as though he had seen something profoundly unsettling. "Observe him," Holmes said quietly. "Not the shadow, the witness." The man's composure faltered, and he murmured something to Larchmont, who turned slightly, following his gaze, but by then the shadow had resumed its ordinary form, and whatever impression had been made was already fading into uncertainty. "An echo of the previous event," Holmes murmured. "But directed quite precisely." Lestrade, who had drawn closer, leaned in. "Did you see it?" "I did," said Holmes, "and so, I think, did our friend there." He indicated the pale gentleman who now appeared to be making his excuses, edging away from the group with visible agitation. "Come," Holmes said, "we must not lose him." We crossed the room with as much discretion as the circumstances allowed, intercepting the man just as he reached the doorway. "Sir," said Holmes gently, "you appear unwell. May I be of assistance?" The man started, clearly startled by the sudden address.
No, I am quite well. Only a moment's dizziness." Holmes regarded him steadily. "A dizziness accompanied by a most particular visual impression, I think." The man's eyes widened. "You saw it too?" "I saw enough to be certain that you did not imagine it," Holmes replied. The gentleman glanced nervously back toward the room. "I must leave?" "I would advise against it," said Holmes quietly. "For if I am correct, you are not the only one who has noticed, and the party responsible may not wish you to depart." This had the desired effect. The man hesitated, then drew us aside into a smaller, adjoining chamber. "My name is Henry Basker," he said in a low voice. Was associated with Mr. Carroway in the arbitration." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you are precisely the individual I had hoped to encounter." Basker ran a hand across his face. "It's that shadow. It was him. I would swear it." "Him?" I repeated. "Adrian Holt," Basker whispered. "I knew him years ago. That outline, that posture, I would recognize it anywhere." Holmes's expression sharpened. "You are certain?" "As certain as I am of my own reflection," Basker said. "But it cannot be. He is gone, vanished." "Or made to appear," Holmes said softly. Basker stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Holmes replied, "that someone present in this house possesses the means to project not merely a shadow, but a memory, and that memory has been selected with great care." Basker's voice trembled. "Why? Why show it to me?" Holmes's gaze remained steady. Because you, Mr. Busker, are connected to the same past as Mr. Carroway, and perhaps to Mr. Holt as well. Tell me, what occurred between them? The man hesitated,
and then spoke in a strained whisper. There was a partnership, an investment scheme. It failed disastrously. Holt accused Carroway of betrayal, of diverting funds. There were threats, legal and otherwise. Then Holt disappeared. We assumed he had fled the country. And you? Holmes asked. What role did you play? I was, aware of certain irregularities, Busker admitted, but I said nothing. It was not my place. Holmes' eyes glinted. And now you are being reminded of that silence. A faint sound reached us from the adjoining room, the murmur of voices followed by a sudden, sharper exclamation. Holmes turned at once. The pattern repeats, he said. Another observation, another reaction. We returned swiftly to the drawing room. This time it was Larchmont himself who stood at the centre, his face pale and rigid, or his gaze fixed upon the wall behind him. The guests had fallen silent, and upon that wall, clearer now, more defined than before, there loomed a shadow that did not belong to any man present. It stood apart, unmistakable in its form. A second figure. Holmes's voice came low and decisive. Now, Watson, said he, we shall see not only the shadow but the hand that casts it. The room had fallen into a silence so complete that the faint ticking of a mantel clock seemed suddenly intrusive. All eyes were fixed upon the wall where the second shadow stood, distinct, unwavering, and utterly unaccounted for by any visible presence. Mr. Edwin Larchmont had stepped back, his composure shaken for the first time since our arrival. His hand trembled slightly as it gripped the back of a chair. "This is some trick," he said, although the firmness of his tone rang hollow. Holmes did not reply at once. Instead, he moved slowly, not toward the wall but toward the arrangement of lamps and screens which he had earlier observed with such care. His eyes flicked from one light source to another, tracing angles, measuring distances, calculating. "Watson," he said quietly, "remain where you are. Lestrade, watch the exits. Our man is present, and he will attempt to withdraw the moment he perceives discovery." Lestrade gave a curt nod and positioned himself near the doorway. Meanwhile, the shadow upon the wall shifted ever so slightly. It did not vanish as before, but lingered, its outline firm, its posture unmistakably distinct from that of any guest. The shoulders were set in that same rigid manner, the head inclined at a familiar angle. "Adrian Holt," murmured Busker behind me, his voice barely audible. Holmes reached the nearest lamp and adjusted it by a fraction. Instantly the shadow wavered, but did not disappear. "Interesting," Holmes said, "not dependent upon a single source." He crossed to a second lamp and altered its position. This time the shadow fractured momentarily, splitting into overlapping forms before reassembling itself. "A composite projection," he continued. "Multiple reflections, carefully aligned." His gaze swept the room, and then stopped. There, near the far wall, stood a tall, thin man in a dark coat. His face was partially obscured by the angle of the light, but I recognized at once the description given by the landlady in Bloomsbury, the precise manner, the stillness of observation. Silas Venn. He stood apart from the others, his hands clasped loosely before him, his expression one of intense concentration rather than alarm. And at his side, barely visible beneath the fold of his coat, I glimpsed a small metallic object, its surface catching the lamplight in a brief telltale glint. Holmes saw it too. "Now," he said softly. In a single fluid motion, he crossed the room. "Mr. Venn," said he, his voice clear and controlled, Your demonstration is most instructive. I wonder if you would be so kind as to conclude it. A ripple of surprise passed through the assembled guests. Venn did not start, nor did he attempt to flee. Instead, he inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a well-placed remark. "You are observant, Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was calm, measured, almost academic.
Though I had hoped for a longer interval before interruption. Lestrade stepped forward at once. "You'll have plenty of time for explanations at the yard. Hand over that device." Venn's lips curved faintly. "Inspector, you mistake the nature of this evening. This is not an act of concealment, but of revelation." Holmes stood before him, his gaze unwavering. "Then perhaps you will reveal for the benefit of all present the purpose of your performance." Venn's eyes moved briefly to the wall where the shadow still lingered. "Perception," he said, "that most unreliable of human faculties. We trust what we see, yet what we see is so easily shaped." "And you have shaped it," Holmes replied, "to resemble a man long absent, Adrian Holt." A murmur spread through the room. Venn nodded. "A convenient figure, distinct enough to be recognized."
"I am yet distant enough to provoke doubt." "Doubt," Holmes repeated, "and fear." "Fear is merely the mind's response to contradiction," Venn said. "When what is seen cannot be reconciled with what is known, the result is instability." Holmes' expression hardened slightly. An instability which in the case of Mr. Jonathan Carroway proved fatal. At this, several guests gasped. Venn did not deny it. "An unfortunate outcome," he said, "though not entirely unexpected." Lestrade stepped closer. "You admit it, then? You caused his death?" "I applied a stimulus," Venn replied. "The result was determined by the subject's own constitution." Holmes spoke quietly, but with unmistakable force. "You engineered that stimulus with precision. You selected a form that would strike at the deepest recesses of his memory. A man he feared, perhaps wronged. You ensured that the illusion would appear real enough to compel belief, yet fleeting enough to evade immediate explanation." Venn inclined his head. "You grasped the principle admirably." "And tonight," Holmes continued, "you repeat the experiment, not to kill, but to demonstrate, to show Mr. Larchmont and others that such manipulation is possible." All eyes turned to Larchmont, whose face had grown ashen. "You sought to secure his confidence," Holmes said, "to prove the value of your device in influencing perception, perhaps in matters of testimony, negotiation, or coercion." Larchmont opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Venn regarded Holmes with a faint smile. "You see through the apparatus to the intention, a rare quality." Holmes' voice remained steady. "And you, Mr. Venn, have allowed your intellect to outrun your judgment. For in demonstrating your power, you have also revealed your method." At a signal from Lestrade, two constables, who had entered quietly during the exchange, stepped forward. "I must ask you to come with us," said the inspector. Venn did not resist. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew the device, a compact arrangement of brass and glass, its surfaces gleaming under the lamplight. "For what it is worth," he said, handing it over, "the design is incomplete. There is still much to refine." Holmes accepted the instrument, turning it over in his hands with keen interest. "I have no doubt," said he, "that in other hands it might have achieved remarkable things. In yours it has achieved something else entirely." Venn met his gaze. "And what is that?" Holmes's expression was grave. "It has shown," said he, "that the most dangerous illusions are not those which deceive the eye, but those which exploit the conscience." As Venn was led away, the shadow upon the wall wavered once more, and then at last vanished entirely. The room seemed to breathe again, and I, for one, could not help but feel that we had witnessed not merely the exposure of a crime, but the unveiling of a most unsettling truth, that even in the clearest light, a shadow may yet conceal more than it reveals. The events of that singular evening at Mr. Edwin Larchmont's residence marked, in many respects, the climax of the affair. Yet it was not until some days later, seated once more in the familiar comfort of Baker Street, that I received from my friend Sherlock Holmes a full and final accounting of the case in all its intricate detail. Venn had been secured, and under Lestrade's firm but methodical questioning, much had come to light. Yet Holmes, as was his habit, preferred not to rely solely upon confession, but to reconstruct the truth from first principles. "You see, Watson," said he as he leaned back in his chair with steepled fingers, "the essence of the case lay not in the device itself, ingenious though it was, but in the selection of its effect." I had been reviewing my notes, yet I set them aside at once. "You mean the choice of Adrian Holt's likeness?" "Precisely. A shadow, no matter how distorted, must still suggest something recognizable to the observer. Venn's brilliance, if I may use the term, was not merely in altering light, but in understanding the mind that interprets it." Holmes rose and moved toward the window, where the pale afternoon light cast long, unnatural shadows upon the wall. "Consider Mr. Carroway," he continued, "a man outwardly composed, yet burdened by a past indiscretion. The financial dealings with Holt, never fully resolved, left him vulnerable. Not to legal consequence, perhaps, but to memory, to guilt." "And Venn discovered this," I said. "He sought it," Holmes corrected. "His visits to Holt in Bloomsbury were not casual. He gathered details, physical description, mannerisms, posture, enough to construct a convincing outline. Then through Marr's position in the household, he gained access to Carroway's habits and the layout of the study." I nodded. The concealed panel provided entry. "And concealment," Holmes added. "From within that recess he could operate the device unseen."
Projecting the altered shadow at precisely the right moment. "But why risk such complexity?" I asked. "Why not employ a more direct means?" Holmes turned back to me. "Because, Watson, Venn was not merely committing a crime, he was demonstrating a principle. He needed a death that would appear natural, yet be unmistakably linked through its peculiar circumstances to his invention. Only then could he present it as proof of concept." "For Larchmont?" I said. "Just so. Larchmont required assurance that the device could influence not merely perception, but outcome. A man frightened to death by what he believes he sees is a far more persuasive example than any mechanical display." I considered this in silence for a moment. "And Marr?" I asked. "What of his role?" "A minor but necessary one," Holmes replied.
His concealment of the device delayed its discovery, which suited Venn's purposes. Yet it also betrayed his own unease. Marr understood, at least in part, the implications of what he had witnessed, and feared being implicated. "And the shadow at Larchmont's house?" I pressed. "Why repeat the effect there?" Holmes smiled faintly. "To complete the demonstration. Carroway's death proved that the method could kill. The second display proved that it could manipulate. By projecting Holt's likeness before Basker and Larchmont, Venn showed that he could evoke recognition, stir memory, and thereby influence behavior." "A weapon of the mind," I said quietly. "Exactly, and like all such weapons, it depends upon the weaknesses of its target." Holmes returned to his chair and took up his pipe. "It is worth noting," he added, "that Venn's device, remarkable though it was, remained imperfect. The shadow could not be sustained indefinitely. Its appearance was fleeting, dependent upon precise alignment and conditions. That limitation, more than anything, betrayed its artificial nature. "And led you to him?" I said. Holmes inclined his head. "Among other factors. The displaced lamp, the wax trace upon the frame, the altered acoustics of the panel, all pointed to intervention. But it was the inconsistency of the shadow that proved decisive. Nature does not err in such a manner, only artifice does." I could not help but marvel at the chain of reasoning which had brought him, step by step, to the truth. "And Holt himself?" I asked. "What became of him?" Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "He remains unaccounted for. Whether he lives still or has long since passed beyond our reach, and I cannot say. But in this case he served only as a symbol, a figure resurrected not in flesh but in memory." There was a pause. "It is a curious thing, Watson," Holmes continued, "that the past, though invisible, may cast the longest shadow of all." I closed my notebook, reflecting upon the strange and unsettling course of the investigation. "And then?" I asked. "We'll stand trial," Holmes said simply. "His intellect will avail him little there. The law concerns itself not with ingenuity, but with consequence." He rose, stretching slightly, and glanced toward the violin which lay upon the side table. "I trust," he added, with a faint return of his usual detachment, "that this matter will discourage others from pursuing similar lines of invention, at least for a time." I smiled. "You believe such ideas can be contained?" Holmes gave a soft, an almost amused exhalation. "My dear Watson," said he, "ideas are like shadows. One may alter their shape, obscure their source, or even make them appear where they do not belong, but one can never wholly prevent their return." He lifted the violin and drew the bow lightly across the strings, producing a single, clear note which seemed to linger in the air. And as I watched him, calm once more, the storm of intellect subsided. I could not help but feel that in this case, as in so many others, it was not merely the mystery that had been resolved, but some deeper truth about the fragile boundary between what we see and what we believe.